Lord Christ.
On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and the inferior wine after the guest has become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Please be seated. We continue to celebrate the Epiphany. Last week, the story of the Epiphany, the story of the Magi, was opened for us by the youth of this church in the ways that only drama and arts can do. We witnessed the star come right down through our church. We witnessed the wise ones follow it to the baby Jesus. And we continue to be warmed and illumined by that story. It really is about the only feast day of the Christian churches that we all agree on: Orthodox, Catholics, Roman or Latin, and Greek, as well as all the mainline Protestant churches. We believe that the glory of God shone through on that day. But now we've changed the liturgical colors. We've got green. But we're still thinking about Epiphany. That is the way that God breaks through our lives to shine the glory of the Lord on something, someone, or someplace. This reminds us that this inbreaking of God, this glory, this light that shines through, happens in ordinary time. That's the color of the green. It happens in ordinary time, in ordinary places, to the likes of you and me. And so that setup brings us to the charming story of the wedding at Cana. Today, the city of Cana is about 4 miles north of Nazareth. And I'm here to tell you that it has an unrivaled, significant wedding industry. Photographers, florists, halls, caterers, unrivaled. But also located nearby, about 7 miles on further north, is a place that Christians, historians, and archaeologists believe has a better claim to being the ancient village of Cana. There are several things that point to that. It's all ruins now. But the ancient Jewish historian Josephus says he once lived there and describes it. St. Jerome of the 4th century gives Cana a location and description that fits the ruins there fairly well. This uninhabited place was also identified in pretty good detail by the accounts of 12th century pilgrims. But here's the problem. This likely spot has a major disadvantage. It's off the road and hard to reach. So it simply is not good for supporting today's thriving wedding industry. In any case, Jesus grew up in this region in Galilee, and his mother was invited to the wedding, and like they went there with some friends and family members. And he was invited, and his friends, the ones who would later, actually very soon, call themselves his disciples. It was Jewish custom that weddings lasted days, usually 7 days. The wedding itself took place in the midst of feast and festivities. There are many things that we know about that time and place, and some that we can imagine. We can pretty be sure that our images of tables groaning abundant with rich food is real, and plenty of drink. These were big treats for guests whose usual diets were grain, vegetables, and herbs, and an occasional fish. Most came from neighboring small villages, and this was a jubilant time. It was a time to see friends and family, kind of like a reunion. For women especially, because when women were married, they were taken after their wedding to the family and village of their husbands. And for some, an occasion like this was the only time they again saw their parents and siblings and childhood friends. Whatever you are imagining, it was a spectacular break in a hard life. The peasant life. It was an occasion when unabashed longings, like a big table of rich food, were fulfilled. There were days of family and fellowship and fun, abundance and love and joy, pure joy. It was the custom for these days-long celebrations that the guests brought food and wine to share. Some biblical scholars have suggested that the tiff between Mary and her oldest son took place because he and his friends had arrived without the customary gifts of wine. There was no wine shop nearby. However, this shortage of wine, however it originated, this shortage of wine, running out of wine would be a terrible embarrassment for the bride's family. More than an embarrassment. You can just almost feel the desperation and shame rising within the bride's father once he knew what was about to happen. But so far, only the servants and Mary seemed to know. She went to her firstborn son and said simply, "Fix it." A practical, motherly instruction. Jesus interjects a spiritual note to the conversation. "My hour has not come." He does seem to know that God has called him to heal the sick and free the captives. But not here, not now. And then Mary does something that I envy. She doesn't persuade her son. She doesn't argue. She simply turns around to the servants and says, "Do as he tells you." Jesus was afraid. Jesus was afraid that those who saw this would think he was performing magic. After all, just a scant time before, he had been fasting in the desert and had rebuffed Satan's challenge to turn stones into bread when he was hungry. But the Mary I admire does not repeat herself. She doesn't cajole. You can tell she believes that he can and will shield the joy that surrounded this bride and groom. Deep joy at this occasion. She believed that Jesus would calm the fears and take away the shame that soon would beset the bride's family. For now, let me, housekeeping. Can you all hear me in the back? Okay. For now, only she and the servants still knew what this troubling drama was that was unfolding. Jesus says to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." Now, that's a lot of jars, heavy jars, and they have to go to a well and hand fill it, no faucet available. He had some time to beat it out the back door. But he doesn't. Water went in, and miraculously wine, the best wine, flowed out. This is a gospel story that has no narrative to it. We just have images, bits of conversation, fragments, a festival setting for people who wanted and needed it, a problem unfolding. Mary's understanding of her friends and of the power of her son. Belief shored up in new disciples. Does the writer of this gospel, John, expect us to take these fragments and make meaning of them for our own lives? I think so. And so I'm just going to go through a few fragments that jump out at me. When you go home and read it again, you will have your own, I'm sure. But here's the ones that captured my imagination this week. This is the only miracle story that takes place in a time and place of fun and happiness. I think it points to the festival, the abundance, the joy that God has in mind for us here and now. This is the only miracle that Mary initiates, and the only one where Jesus is called upon to be creative. It's the only miracle story where Jesus takes water intended by the observant Jews gathered there, water that was there to fulfill the rules of religious ceremonial cleansing, purification, and then transforms that ponderous religious symbol into the enduring symbol of celebration. The miracle of changing water into wine, a one-time event, occurred in an obscure village whose whereabouts that archaeologists cannot even agree upon. What does that mean for our small town? This was the first time, but we know that it was not the last, when Jesus changed his mind and his plans to serve someone else. We might assume that this miracle happened by candlelight, and yet it's the first sign that reveals, that shines light upon God's continuing creation, unhindered within the life of Jesus. This is Jesus' glory. This miracle story reminds us that God reveals God's self to us in the midst of joy and happiness and ordinary events in human life. It's not a drama. It's not magic. This is the connection to God, who is always creating in our lives. Epiphany is a moment of creation, continuing creation for us. And so I pray that we allow God's creativity to work for us and through us, to lead us to reveal God's power to shield the joyous and care for the weak. God's love for the neglected may be shined through us, and God's mercy for all of us sinners. Above all, let us pray for an epiphany that reveals to us in our lives who Jesus Christ really is. Amen.